Have you ever driven past a house and felt it watching you back? Not in the way people talk about houses having personality or character. I mean something more specific than that. A feeling that the structure itself has developed a kind of awareness through decades of standing empty. That the vacancy inside has become its own presence, something that occupies the rooms more completely than furniture or people ever could. There is a property in the Missouri Ozarks that locals stopped talking about sometime in the late 1950s. Not because they forgot about it, because talking about it seemed to give it more weight in the world, and the consensus became that the less weight it had, the better for everyone involved. The house sits about 40 miles west of Springfield down a county road that floods every spring and becomes impassable for weeks at a time. It's a two-story structure built in a style that doesn't quite match anything else in the region. Too tall for the local farmhouses of that period, too plain for the Victorian influences that had reached rural Missouri by the early 1900s. The proportions are slightly wrong in a way that's hard to articulate until you're standing in front of it. The windows are too narrow. The roof pitch is too steep. The whole building seems compressed somehow, as though it's being pressed down by the weight of the sky above it. In the summer of 1942, something happened in that house that caused 3 separate clergy members, a Catholic priest, a Lutheran minister, and an Amish bishop, to meet together in a room for the first time in their lives. According to the diary of Reverend Thomas Whitmore, housed in the Springfield Greene County Library archives, they sat across from each other at a table in the county courthouse and did not speak for nearly 20 minutes. Just sat there, looking at their hands, trying to find language for what they'd each been told. Before I go further, I want to be clear about something. What I'm about to tell you comes from county property records, church correspondence that survived in private collections, and oral histories recorded by the Missouri Folk Studies Project between 1973 and 1981. Some details align perfectly across multiple sources. Others contradict each other in ways that suggest either confusion, deliberate obscuring, or the simple fact that different people experienced the same events from different angles and came away with different understandings. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to show you what the records contain and what they cannot explain. The house is still there. It's still empty. And if you ask anyone over 70 in that part of Stone County why nobody has ever torn it down or sold the land, they'll change the subject so smoothly you might not even notice it happening. In the spring of 1939, a man named Jakob Schrock purchased 160 acres of hillside property in Stone County, Missouri for $800. The transaction was recorded on April 14th at the county courthouse in Galena. The deed lists his occupation as farmer and his residence as Arthur, Illinois, which was and remains a predominantly Amish community. Jakob was 47 years old at the time of purchase. According to census records from 1940, he stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, which was considered tall for men of his generation. He had gray hair that had gone fully white by the time he was 40, a detail mentioned in multiple accounts because people found it striking against his relatively young face. His hands showed the specific callousing pattern of someone who'd worked with horses and hand tools for decades. Thick pads of hardened skin across the palm just below the fingers. Permanent staining around the nail beds from soil that never quite washes out. The Arthur community he came from had been established in the 1860s by Amish families migrating west from Pennsylvania and Ohio. By the 1930s, it was one of the larger and more prosperous Amish settlements in Illinois, known particularly for its furniture makers and its adherence to older ordnung, the unwritten rules that govern Amish life and practice. Why Jakob left Arthur is not explained in any surviving correspondence. What we know is that he came alone. His wife, Anna, had died in childbirth in 1927, along with the infant. He had no other children. He had 3 brothers still living in Arthur, two sisters in Pennsylvania. He maintained correspondence with them through the early months of 1939, but those letters, preserved by his niece and later donated to the Illinois Mennonite Historical and Genealogical Society, stop abruptly in June of that year. The last letter, dated June 9th, is brief. In it, Jakob tells his brother Levi that the house is nearly finished and that the land is good for hay, though the timber is too dense in places. He mentions that he has purchased a team of draft horses from a farm near Branson. Then this line, "The quiet here is different than at home. It is a listening kind of quiet." After that, nothing for 3 months. The house Jakob built was constructed over the course of 8 weeks in April and May of 1939. According to building permits filed with the county, which were not required at that time but which Jakob filed anyway, a detail that speaks to his character: he hired no outside labor. The structure was built entirely by his own hands, using timber milled from his own property. This is unusual for several reasons. Amish communities typically build structures collectively through barn-raising traditions, with extended family and church members traveling significant distances to help. For a man to build alone suggests either profound isolation from his community or a deliberate choice to work in solitude. Given Jakob's background and the distances involved, both explanations are plausible. The house itself is documented in a single photograph that survives in the Stone County Historical Society collection. The image was taken by a traveling photographer named Virgil Cates in August of 1939. Cates was employed by the Farm Security Administration to document rural life during the Depression, though this particular photograph was never included in the FSA archives and only surfaced decades later when Cates's daughter donated his personal collection to the Historical Society. The photograph shows the house from the southwest. 2 stories, wood frame construction, painted white, though the paint appears thin and uneven in the image. The windows are tall and narrow, 12 panes each, arranged symmetrically, 4 on the ground floor, 4 on the second story. The front door is centered, painted black, with no porch or overhang. The roof is steeply pitched with cedar shingles. Behind the house, the Ozark Hills rise in layers of darkening blue. What the photograph does not show is any evidence of habitation. No curtains in the windows. No smoke from the chimney, despite the image being taken in early morning when cook stoves would typically be lit. No tools leaning against the walls, no wagon, no animals visible in the frame. The land around the house is cleared but not cultivated, just bare dirt and scattered stumps still visible from recent logging. Virgil Cates's notes, written on the back of the photograph, say only, "Schrock property, Stone Co. owner, declined portrait." The property sits in a region where the Ozark Plateau begins to transition into more dramatic hill country. The soil is rocky and acidic, better suited to timber than agriculture, though sufficient for the kind of small-scale farming that Amish communities traditionally practiced. Water would have come from a spring on the property, still marked on modern topographical maps, that emerges about 200 yards upslope from where the house stands. In the 1840s and 50s, this region had been home to scattered homesteaders, but most had abandoned their claims during the Civil War when guerrilla fighting made the borderlands uninhabitable. By the 1930s, the area was only sparsely populated, with farms separated by miles of unbroken forest. The nearest neighbor to Jacob's property was a man named Everett Hobson, who lived 3 miles southeast and ran a small sawmill operation. Hobson is mentioned in county records as the person who reported Jakob missing in January of 1940. He told the sheriff that he had not seen Jakob since October and that smoke had not been rising from the chimney for weeks, despite temperatures dropping below freezing. When Deputy Curtis Mabry drove out to investigate on January 23, 1940, he found the house locked. According to his report, filed with the Stone County Sheriff's Office and preserved in their archives, he circled the structure and looked through each window. The interior was empty, not just unoccupied. Empty. No furniture, no stove, no tools, no personal effects of any kind. The floors were bare wood. The walls were bare plaster. The rooms contained nothing. This was strange for multiple reasons. Building permits indicated Jakob had purchased materials for interior finishing. Neighbors who had seen him in Galena mentioned he'd bought a cook stove, a table, chairs, and bedding from the general store. Those items should have been somewhere. They were not in the house. They were not in any outbuilding. They simply were not there. Deputy Mabry's report notes that the door locks were engaged from the inside. He does not explain how he verified this, but the implication is that someone would have needed to lock the door and then exit through a window, which makes no sense for an Amish man who would not have been concerned with security in that way. The county made attempts to contact Jakob's family in Illinois. His brother Levi responded with a letter, also preserved in county files, stating that they had not heard from Jakob since June and that they had assumed he was simply adjusting to his new circumstances. The family requested that the county continue to maintain the property taxes until Jakob could be located or declared legally dead. For 2 years the property sat empty, and the county collected no taxes because the family paid them promptly. Then, in the autumn of 1942, something changed. The first person to enter the house after Deputy Mabry's investigation was a woman named Helen Corrigan. She was 34 years old, originally from St. Louis, and had moved to Stone County in 1941 with her husband, Michael, who worked for the Missouri Department of Conservation, surveying timber resources. Helen taught primary school in Galena and was known for her methodical nature and her interest in local history. Helen had heard about the abandoned Schrock property from other teachers and had developed a curiosity about why an Amish man would travel so far from his community only to disappear. In September of 1942, she drove out to the property alone on a Saturday afternoon. This detail comes from a letter she wrote to her sister, Margaret, dated September 28th. The letter is part of the Corrigan family papers held at the Missouri State Archives. In the letter, Helen describes parking her car at the base of the long driveway and walking up to the house. She notes that the grass had grown tall around the foundation and that small saplings had begun to establish themselves in the cleared yard. The house itself appeared structurally sound. No broken windows, no visible damage to the roof or siding. The white paint had begun to peel in places, exposing gray wood underneath. She writes, "I tried the front door expecting it to be locked, but it opened easily. The hinges made no sound. Inside, the air was cool and still in a way that made me aware of my own breathing. The floor was dusty, but intact. All the windows were closed. The light coming through them had a gray quality that made everything look older than it was." Helen walked through the ground floor first, 2 rooms on either side of a central hallway. The eastern room would have been a parlor or sitting room, the western room, a kitchen or dining area. Both were empty. The walls showed no marks where furniture might have sat. The floors showed no wear patterns from foot traffic. It was as though the house had been built and never occupied, despite evidence that Jakob had lived there for at least several months. She climbed the stairs to the second floor. The treads were solid, no creaking. At the top of the stairs, a hallway ran the length of the house with 2 rooms on each side. 4 bedrooms, all empty, all the same, bare walls, bare floors, closed windows. In the northeastern bedroom, Helen noticed something that made her pause. She describes it carefully in her letter. There were marks on the floor near the window, not scratches exactly, more like impressions, as if something heavy had sat there for a long time and compressed the wood. But the marks were in the shape of circles, about 4 inches across and arranged in a pattern that made no sense for furniture legs. She counted 9 circular impressions arranged in 3 rows of 3, forming a square roughly 6 feet on each side. The wood within each circle was darker than the surrounding floor, suggesting prolonged contact with something. Helen knelt down and touched one of the marks. The wood felt smooth and slightly cooler than the rest of the floor. She stood up and looked out the window. From that vantage point, she could see across the valley to the south and west. The view was expansive, miles of forested hills with no visible structures except a barn roof in the far distance that might have been Everett Hobson's property. She writes, "I had the distinct feeling that I was not alone in the room, not in a frightening way, more like the feeling of being in a library or a church where you become conscious of the quiet and the space around you. I stood there for several minutes, just looking out the window, and then I left. I did not go back downstairs immediately. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, trying to decide if I should look in the other bedrooms, and then I decided I should not. I cannot explain why. I simply felt that I had seen what I was meant to see." Helen left the house, pulled the front door closed behind her, and drove home. She told her husband about the visit that evening. According to her letter, Michael listened carefully and then said he thought it would be better if she did not go back alone. She agreed. 2 weeks later, on October 10th, Helen was approached after Sunday church services by a woman named Dorothy Kern. Dorothy was 62 years old, a widow who lived on a farm north of Galena. She was known in the community as someone who kept to herself but who maintained careful attention to local affairs. She had a narrow face and gray eyes that did not blink as often as most people's. Her hands were large for a woman with prominent knuckles from arthritis that had developed early. Dorothy asked Helen if she had been out to the Schrock house. Helen said yes. Dorothy nodded slowly and said, "What did you see upstairs?" Helen describes feeling suddenly cold despite the warm October afternoon. She asked how Dorothy knew she had gone upstairs. Dorothy said, "Because that's where it is. Everyone who goes there goes upstairs. Did you see the marks in the northeast room?" Helen confirmed that she had. Dorothy took her by the elbow and guided her to a bench near the church entrance where they could speak privately. What Dorothy told her that afternoon became the foundation for everything that followed. Dorothy had been to the Schrock house 3 times. The first time was in March of 1942, before Helen had moved to the area. Dorothy had driven out there because she had heard that the property was abandoned and she thought it might be available for purchase. She had recently sold her farm and was looking for a smaller piece of land where she could keep a garden and a few chickens. When she entered the house, she experienced the same sensation Helen described: coolness, stillness, the awareness of empty space. She went upstairs and found the marks in the northeastern bedroom. Unlike Helen, Dorothy had stayed in the room longer. She had sat down on the floor next to the window and waited. For what? She could not say. She just felt that waiting was the appropriate thing to do. After perhaps 20 minutes, she noticed that the light coming through the window had changed quality. Not dimmed exactly. Changed. It became thicker somehow, more present, as though the air itself was becoming visible. She watched this happen slowly over the course of several minutes. Then she heard a sound. She described it to Helen as similar to breathing, but not human breathing. Slower and deeper. The kind of rhythm you might hear if you put your ear against the chest of a very large animal. It did not come from any particular direction. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, or from the space between the walls. Dorothy stood up and walked to the center of the room. The breathing sound continued. She spoke aloud and said, "I am not afraid of you." The sound stopped immediately. She waited for several more minutes in absolute silence, and then she left. When she reached her car, she realized she had been inside the house for over 2 hours, though it had felt like 30 minutes at most. Dorothy returned a second time in May. She brought a notebook and a pen with the intention of documenting anything unusual. This time, when she entered the northeastern bedroom, the marks on the floor were arranged differently. No longer a 9-dot grid, Now they formed a circle around the perimeter of the room, 12 marks evenly spaced like hours on a clock face. The wood within each mark had the same darkened, compressed appearance. She sat in the center of the circle and opened her notebook. She wrote the date, the time, and a description of the room. Then she wrote, "If you can hear me, show me something I can understand." Nothing happened for nearly an hour. Then the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Dorothy could see her breath. She stood up and walked to the window. The glass was covered in a thin layer of frost, despite it being late May, with temperatures in the 70s outside. On the frost, letters were forming, not written by any visible hand, just appearing slowly, as though being drawn from the inside of the glass. She watched them take shape. They spelled, "Wait." Dorothy copied the word into her notebook. Then she asked, "Wait for what?" The frost began to melt immediately, running down the glass in thin streams. Within minutes, it was gone completely. The temperature in the room returned to normal. Dorothy checked her watch and found that 3 hours had passed. Her third visit occurred in August, 1 month before Helen's first visit. This time, Dorothy brought a camera. She had decided that if something was manifesting in that room, she wanted evidence of it beyond her own testimony. She arrived in the afternoon and went directly upstairs. The marks on the floor had changed again. Now they formed a single spiral, starting at the window and wrapping inward toward the center of the room, ending in a tight coil about 2 feet in diameter. Dorothy counted 43 individual impressions following the spiral path. She set up her camera on a tripod in the doorway, aimed at the center of the spiral. Then she sat down at the outer edge and placed her right hand on the first mark. The wood felt warm under her palm. She moved her hand to the second mark. Also warm, she continued this way, moving slowly along the spiral, placing her hand on each mark in sequence. When she reached the center, she felt a vibration. It started in her hand and moved up her arm into her chest. Not painful, not unpleasant, just present and undeniable. She describes it in her testimony as feeling similar to standing near a large bell after it has been struck, when you can feel the sound as much as hear it. She looked up at the camera, wondering if it was recording anything unusual. As she watched, the camera toppled forward off the tripod and fell to the floor. The impact broke the lens and ruined the film inside. Dorothy stood up quickly and left the room. She did not go back. When Dorothy finished telling Helen the story, she said, "I don't know what's in that house. I don't know if it's something that was always there or something Jakob brought with him or something he became. But I know it's real, and I know it's trying to communicate. I also know I'm not the person it's waiting for." Helen asked what made Dorothy think it was waiting for someone specific. Dorothy said, "Because every time I ask it a question, the answer is always the same. Wait." Helen did not return to the house immediately. She spent October thinking about what Dorothy had told her and trying to decide whether she believed it. She discussed it with Michael, who was skeptical but not dismissive. He said that the Ozarks had always been a region where strange things were reported, and that in his work, surveying timber resources, he had encountered areas where compasses behaved erratically and where animals refused to enter. In early November, Helen received a letter from Dorothy. It was brief and formal. Dorothy wrote that she had spoken with Father Edmund Carrick at St. Catherine's Catholic Church in Galena about the Schrock house. Father Carrick had agreed to visit the property and assess whether there was any spiritual element that required attention. Dorothy asked if Helen would be willing to accompany them. Helen agreed. On November 14, 1942, the three of them drove out to the property together. Father Carrick was 48 years old, originally from Boston, and had been assigned to the Galena parish in 1937. He was a tall man with narrow shoulders and a face that people described as gentle. He had thick hands with short fingers, the hands of someone who had done physical labor before entering the priesthood. According to Helen's account, recorded in an oral history interview conducted by the Missouri Folk Studies Project in 1976, Father Carrick entered the house first. He carried a small leather case containing holy water, a rosary, and a Bible. He blessed the threshold before entering, making the sign of the cross and speaking a prayer in Latin that Helen did not understand. They walked through the ground floor together, Father Carrick blessing each room. Nothing unusual occurred. The house was exactly as Helen had found it in September, empty, clean, still. When they reached the stairs, Father Carrick paused. He looked up toward the second floor and then back at Helen and Dorothy. He said, "Something is up there. I can feel it, not evil, not good, just present." They climbed the stairs together. At the top, Father Carrick stopped again. He closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them. He said, "The northeast room." They walked down the hallway to the northeastern bedroom. The door was closed, though Helen was certain she had left it open during her first visit. Father Carrick opened it slowly. The marks on the floor had changed again. Now there was only one mark, a perfect circle, approximately 8 feet in diameter, centered in the room. The wood within the circle was so dark it appeared almost black. The air inside the room was noticeably colder than the hallway. Father Carrick stepped into the room and knelt down at the edge of the circle. He opened his case and removed the bottle of holy water. He stood and began to walk the perimeter of the circle, sprinkling water and reciting prayers. Helen and Dorothy stood in the doorway watching. When Father Carrick completed the circle and returned to his starting point, he stopped. He was facing the window. He stood very still for a long moment, and then he turned to look at Helen and Dorothy. His face had changed. Helen describes it as looking younger somehow, as though years had been pulled back from his features. He said, "It's a threshold." Dorothy asked what he meant. Father Carrick walked to the window and placed his hand against the glass. He said, "This place, this room, it's not meant to keep something in or keep something out. It's meant to mark a crossing point, a place where one kind of space meets another." He turned back to face them. He said, "Jakob Schrock understood what this was. That's why he built the house here, not to live in, to tend, like a lighthouse or a border station. He was keeping watch over something." Helen asked what happened to Jacob. Father Carrick shook his head. He said, "I think he went through. When he was finished watching, or when whatever he was waiting for finally came, he went through." Dorothy asked if Father Carrick could close the threshold. He said no. He said he did not have that authority or that knowledge, and that he was not certain it should be closed even if it could be. They left the house together and stood outside for several minutes not speaking. Father Carrick blessed the property and said a final prayer. Then he told Helen and Dorothy that he would be writing to the diocese in Kansas City to report what he had found. He said he did not expect them to take any action, but that it needed to be documented. The three of them agreed not to discuss what they had experienced with anyone beyond necessary authorities. Father Carrick intended to contact church leadership. Dorothy intended to contact the county sheriff. Helen intended to speak with her husband and with Reverend Thomas Whitmore at the Lutheran church she attended. Within 2 weeks, word had spread quietly through the religious community in Stone County that something unusual was occurring at the abandoned Schrock property. By early December, Bishop Abraham Yoder from the Amish community in Seymour, Missouri, roughly 80 miles north, had heard about the situation and requested permission to visit the house. Bishop Yoder was 71 years old and had served as bishop for over 30 years. He was a small man, no more than 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a white beard that reached the center of his chest. He had blue eyes that several people described as unusually clear for someone his age. His hands were marked by decades of carpentry work, with scars across the knuckles and missing portions of 2 fingernails from accidents with saws and planes. Bishop Yoder arrived in Galena on December 5th and immediately contacted Father Carrick. The two men met and spoke for several hours. No record exists of their conversation, but the following day Father Carrick contacted Reverend Whitmore and suggested that the three of them visit the property together. This was the meeting I mentioned at the beginning. Three clergy from three separate traditions sitting across from each other in the Stone County Courthouse, trying to find common language for what they were about to do. According to Reverend Whitmore's diary, they agreed to approach the house as investigators rather than as clergy attempting to perform any kind of spiritual intervention. They would observe, document, and report. Nothing more. On December 8, 1942, the three men drove out to the Schrock property. It was a Tuesday. The temperature was in the low 40s. The sky was overcast with low clouds that made the afternoon light gray and flat. They entered the house together and went directly upstairs to the northeastern bedroom. The door was open. The circle on the floor remained, 8 feet in diameter, dark wood compressed and smooth. Bishop Yoder walked into the center of the circle and stood there with his eyes closed for several minutes. Father Carrick and Reverend Whitmore remained in the doorway. When Bishop Yoder opened his eyes, he spoke in Pennsylvania Dutch. Father Carrick and Reverend Whitmore did not understand the words, but they both later described feeling that the language itself carried weight in the room, as though the sounds were being absorbed by the walls and floor. Bishop Yoder stopped speaking and walked to the window. He placed both hands against the glass and bowed his head. He remained in that position for approximately 10 minutes. Then he stepped back, turned to face the other two men, and spoke in English. He said, "Jacob is at peace. He found what he was looking for." Reverend Whitmore asked how Bishop Yoder knew this. Yoder said, "Because I asked, and I was answered." The three men left the house and returned to Galena. That evening they met again at Reverend Whitmore's home and drafted a joint letter to the Stone County Commissioners. The letter, preserved in county archives, stated that the Schrock property contained an element that defied conventional explanation, but posed no immediate danger to the community. They recommended that the property remain sealed and that no development or sale be permitted until such time as the situation could be better understood. The commissioners, faced with a letter signed by three respected clergy members, agreed to the recommendation. The property was reclassified as held in perpetual trust by the county pending resolution of the ownership question. Since Jakob Schrock had never been declared legally dead and his family continued to pay taxes, the arrangement created a kind of administrative limbo that has persisted for over 80 years. In January of 1943, Helen Corrigan wrote a final letter to her sister describing what had happened. She concluded with this paragraph: "I have thought about Jakob Schrock nearly every day since we first went to his house. I imagine him building it alone over those months in the spring, cutting the timber, milling the boards, raising the walls, working in silence because there was no one to speak to. I imagine him finishing the house and standing back to look at it, and knowing that it was not a home, but a kind of monument or marker, something built to acknowledge a boundary. I think he was a man who understood that the world has edges we cannot see, and that someone has to stand at those edges and bear witness. I think he did that work for as long as he was able, and then he chose to cross over rather than turn back. I don't know if that makes him brave or lost or something else entirely. I just know that I would not have had the courage to do what he did." Helen and Michael Corrigan moved away from Stone County in 1946 when Michael was transferred to a different position with the Conservation Department. Helen taught school in Jefferson City until her retirement in 1968. She died in 1981 at the age of 73. Dorothy Kern lived on her small property north of Galena until her death in 1957. She never married again. Neighbors reported that she sometimes drove out to the Schrock house and sat in her car at the base of the driveway for hours at a time, never entering the property, just watching the house from a distance. Father Edmund Carrick served at St. Catherine's until 1953, when he was transferred to a parish in St. Louis. He died in 1967. In his personal effects, his niece found a small wooden box containing a single item, a photograph of the Schrock house taken from the northeast bedroom window, showing the view across the valley. On the back, in Father Carrick's handwriting, "Some doors are meant to stay open." Bishop Abraham Yoder continued to serve the Seymour community until his death in 1949. At his funeral, several people mentioned that in his final years he had spoken occasionally about a house in the Ozarks where he had once felt the presence of God more clearly than anywhere else in his life, including in any church. Reverend Thomas Whitmore remained in Galena until his retirement in 1958. His diary entries about the Schrock house continue sporadically through 1957, the last entry dated November 3rd. He writes, "Drove past the property today. The house still stands. I wonder sometimes if Jakob built it strong enough to last until whatever he was waiting for finally arrives, or if it already has, and we simply lack the capacity to recognize it. The house stands empty still. The property taxes continue to be paid, though by whom is unclear. County records show payments arriving annually from a trust account established in 1951, but the trust documents are sealed, and the administrator is listed only as a law firm in Springfield that dissolved in 1973. In 2003, a team of paranormal investigators from a television production company requested permission to film inside the house. The county commissioners denied the request without explanation. Similar requests have been made approximately once every 2 to 3 years since then. All have been denied. Local teenagers occasionally drive out to the property on dares, but most do not enter the house. Those who do typically report nothing unusual except a feeling of profound emptiness and cold air, even in summer. A few have mentioned seeing marks on the floor upstairs, though descriptions vary, and no photographs have been successfully taken inside the house due to consistent equipment failures. In 2012, during a severe thunderstorm, a lightning strike destroyed a large oak tree approximately 50 yards from the house. The tree fell across the driveway, blocking vehicle access. County road crews cleared the tree within a week, but in doing so, they noticed that the grass and vegetation around the house had formed a distinct circular pattern, with taller, darker growth forming a ring roughly 100 feet in diameter centered on the structure. Soil samples were taken, but showed no unusual composition. The pattern remains visible in satellite imagery. The nearest current resident to the property is a man named Leonard Haskins, who lives approximately 2 miles south and operates a small cattle ranch. In a 2019 interview with a local history podcast, Haskins stated that he had lived in the area for 47 years and had never set foot on the Schrock property. When asked why, he said, "Some places don't want visitors. You learn to respect that." What can we know for certain about the Schrock property and the events of 1942? We know that Jakob Schrock purchased the land and built the house. We have the deed, the building permits he filed voluntarily, and the photograph documenting the completed structure. We know he disappeared sometime between June and October of 1939, and that his personal effects were never located. We know the house was found empty despite evidence that he had furnished it. We know that between March and December of 1942, multiple credible witnesses reported unusual phenomena inside the northeastern bedroom. We have written testimony from Helen Corrigan, Dorothy Kern, Father Edmund Carrick, Bishop Abraham Yoder, and Reverend Thomas Whitmore. These were not people prone to fabrication or hysteria. They were educated, respected members of their communities with no apparent motive for deception. We know that 3 clergy members from different religious traditions agreed that something unexplainable was occurring, and that they jointly recommended the property be held in trust and not developed. We have the letter they signed and the county's response. What we do not know is what actually exists in that house. The testimony describes marks on the floor that change configuration between visits. It describes temperature changes, frost forming on windows in warm weather, sounds like breathing, and sensations of presence. It describes Bishop Yoder claiming to receive communication that Jakob Schrock was at peace. There are several possible interpretations. The first is that the witnesses experienced genuine paranormal phenomena that cannot be explained by current scientific understanding. This interpretation takes the testimony at face value and suggests that the house sits at some kind of boundary point between physical space and something else. What that something else might be, another dimension, a spiritual realm, or simply an aspect of reality we don't yet have frameworks to describe, remains undefined. The second interpretation is that the witnesses experienced a shared psychological phenomenon triggered by expectation and suggestion. Dorothy Kern's initial experience created a narrative framework that subsequent visitors unconsciously reinforced. The house itself, being isolated and architecturally unusual, created an atmosphere conducive to heightened suggestibility. The marks on the floor could have been misperceived natural wear patterns. The temperature changes could have been drafts. The sounds could have been building settling or wind. The third interpretation is that Jakob Schrock deliberately created a mystery, possibly as a response to grief over his wife's death and his own isolation. He may have arranged marks on the floor, left the house empty to create intrigue, and then disappeared on purpose to remove himself from a life that had become unbearable. The subsequent reports from witnesses represent genuine perception filtered through the lens of mystery he intentionally created. A fourth interpretation is that something geologically or environmentally unusual exists at that location. The Ozarks sit on ancient limestone formations with extensive cave systems. It's possible the house was built over an undiscovered cave or geological feature that creates unusual acoustic or atmospheric effects. The marks on the floor could relate to subsidence or compression from underground voids. The breathing sound could be air movement through fissures in the bedrock. None of these interpretations can be verified or disproven with the evidence available. The house has never been subjected to systematic scientific investigation. No geological survey has been conducted of the immediate property. No attempt has been made to document the floor marks with controlled photography or measurement. The reason for this lack of investigation is worth examining. The county's position since 1942 has been to maintain the status quo. No development, no sale, no systematic study. This position was established based on the recommendation of clergy members who believed the site should be left undisturbed. That decision reflects an interesting cultural stance. The acknowledgement that some things may be better left unknown. Whether that stance is wisdom or avoidance depends on your perspective. From an archival standpoint, the documentation of the Schrock case is frustratingly incomplete. Jakob's letters to his family stop abruptly with no explanation. The photograph taken by Virgil Cates is the only visual record of the house during Jacob's presumed occupancy. Helen Corrigan's letters to her sister end in early 1943 with no further mention of the property. Father Carrick's official report to the diocese, if one exists, has never been made public. Bishop Yoder's testimony survives only through second-hand accounts. What we have are fragments of a story told by people who were deeply affected by their experiences, but who lack the framework or vocabulary to explain what they encountered in terms that would satisfy skeptical inquiry. The most honest answer to what happened at the Schrock house is that we don't know. We have testimony describing events that don't fit conventional explanation. We have a physical structure that continues to exist and that the community has chosen to leave sealed. We have a pattern of administrative and cultural avoidance that has persisted for over 80 years. That pattern itself is data. When a community collectively decides that a place should be left alone, that decision tells us something about how threatening or disturbing the place is perceived to be, even if we can't verify the specifics of why it generates that response. The Schrock house remains legally held in perpetual trust. The taxes are still paid. The structure is still maintained at a minimal level to prevent total collapse. Someone somewhere has decided it's worth preserving, even though no one will explain why. That maintenance suggests intention. Someone believes the house serves a function or marks a significance that justifies its continued existence. Whether that function is spiritual, historical, or something else entirely, we cannot determine from the records available. I think about Jakob Schrock sometimes when I'm driving through the Ozarks, about what it means to build something alone, not just the physical labor of it. Cutting timber, raising walls, fitting boards, but the psychological weight of working in isolation toward a purpose only you understand. The Amish tradition Jakob came from values community building, above almost everything else. The barn raising is not just practical efficiency, it's theology made visible. The idea that meaningful work requires collective effort, and that no person should labor entirely alone. For Jakob to reject that tradition and build his house with his own hands over 8 weeks suggests either profound alienation from his community or profound commitment to a task he believed could not be shared. Both possibilities are lonely. Both suggest a man carrying something heavy. The letters Jacob wrote to his brother Levi in those early months describe the land and the work, but never explain why he came to Missouri or what he hoped to accomplish. The last letter mentions that the quiet is a listening kind of quiet. That phrase has stayed with me. Not a peaceful quiet or an empty quiet. A listening quiet as though the land itself was paying attention. Helen Corrigan understood something about Jacob that I think is worth sitting with. In her final letter, she wrote that she believed Jacob was a man who understood that the world has edges we cannot see, and that someone has to stand at those edges and bear witness. I think she was right. There are places in every landscape that feel different, not dangerous necessarily, just present in a way that most places are not. You can walk past them every day and never notice, or you can stop and pay attention and realize that something about the air or the light or the way sound moves is not quite like it is anywhere else. Most people, when they encounter a place like that, they move on. They don't have language for what they're sensing, so they dismiss it or forget it. But some people stop, some people stay, some people build houses. I don't know if Jakob Schrock found something at that location, or if he brought something with him. I don't know if the phenomena Helen and Dorothy and the clergy members described were real in the way we usually mean real, or if they were real in some other way we don't have good categories for. What I do know is that multiple thoughtful, credible people went into that house expecting to find nothing and came out changed. They came out believing they had encountered something that required response. For Helen, that response was documentation. For Dorothy, it was repeated visitation. For Father Carrick, it was blessing and acknowledgement. For Bishop Yoder, it was communication with something beyond language. For Reverend Whitmore, it was ongoing witness through his diary entries that continued for 15 years after his single visit. Each of them tried to make sense of the experience within the frameworks available to them. Helen used historical inquiry. Dorothy used patience and observation. The clergy used the tools of their traditions, prayer, blessing, spiritual interpretation. None of them claimed to have answers. All of them claimed the experience mattered. That's what separates this from most stories about haunted houses or paranormal locations. The people involved didn't approach it as entertainment or thrills. They approached it as a serious question about the nature of reality and their place in it. They treated the house with respect. They treated Jakob's absence with respect. They treated their own uncertainty with respect. and the community, in turn, respected their conclusions enough to seal the property and leave it undisturbed. That collective agreement that some places should be left alone is rare in American culture. We typically assume that empty land should be developed, that mysteries should be solved, that every question has an answer waiting to be discovered through sufficient investigation. The Schrock property represents a different stance, a willingness to say, we don't understand this. We're not certain we should understand it. We're going to leave it as it is. Whether that's wisdom or fear or both is something each person has to decide for themselves. I've never been to the house. I've driven past the turnoff several times while researching this story, and each time I've decided not to go up the driveway. Not because I'm afraid exactly, more because I'm not certain I have the right. If Jakob built that house to mark a threshold or to tend a boundary, then visiting it as a curious outsider seems like a violation of whatever work he was doing. That might sound overly cautious, but I think there's value in caution when approaching things we don't understand. The rush to explain or debunk or document can sometimes damage the very thing we're trying to investigate. Some phenomena might require a light touch or no touch at all. The house is still there. The county maintains the access road. The taxes are still paid. The structure still stands. Someone is making sure it continues to exist, even though they won't say why. That ongoing maintenance is its own kind of testimony. It says, this place matters. We don't know exactly why or how, but it matters enough to preserve. I think about the marks on the floor that changed configuration between visits. If those marks were real, if they were truly appearing and rearranging themselves, then they were a form of language, not English or Pennsylvania Dutch or any spoken language, but communication nonetheless, patterns that shifted to convey meaning to whoever was paying attention. Dorothy Kern paid attention. She sat in that room and waited, and asked questions and received answers in frost on glass and vibration in her palm, and circular impressions in old wood. She didn't claim to understand the answers. She just received them and documented them and kept returning. I think about what it would mean to be that patient, to sit in an empty room in an empty house and wait for something to make itself known, to trust that the waiting itself is meaningful, even if nothing dramatic occurs. Most of us don't have that kind of patience. We want immediate clarity. We want the mystery solved, or the ghost confronted, or the phenomenon explained. We want resolution. But some things don't resolve. Some things just continue. Year after year, decade after decade, marks on a floor in a room no one enters, a house that no one tears down, a story that no one can quite finish telling because the ending hasn't happened yet. Or maybe the ending happened in 1939 when Jakob Schrock walked through whatever threshold he had built that house to mark. Maybe he found what he was looking for. Maybe Bishop Yoder was right, and Jakob is at peace in a way that we, still on this side of the threshold, cannot fully comprehend. The alternative is that Jakob died alone and confused in those hills, that his body is lying somewhere in a ravine or a sinkhole, that the house is just a house and the marks are just marks, and the whole story is people seeing patterns in randomness, because that's what human minds do. Both versions are sad in different ways. One is sad because a man disappeared and was never found. The other is sad because a man found what he was looking for, and it required him to leave everything behind. I don't know which is true. I don't know if truth even works that way in cases like this, where the evidence is fragmentary and the testimony is experiential, and the only people who might have answers are either dead or not talking. What I do know is that the house continues to stand. That's not a metaphor or a philosophical point. It's a literal fact. The structure remains. The county protects it. The threshold, if that's what it is, remains open. And somewhere, somehow, the taxes are still being paid. That's the part I keep coming back to. Someone is paying to maintain that property. Someone believes it's worth the expense. Someone thinks it matters enough to preserve, even though they won't explain why to the county or to researchers or to anyone asking questions. That ongoing anonymous stewardship suggests intention and commitment. It suggests that whatever Jakob Schrock was doing in 1939 is not finished, that the work continues even though the original worker is gone. Maybe that's what scares clergy members, not ghosts or demons or supernatural threats, but the idea that some work in the world is not ours to complete or comprehend, that there are tasks being carried out on scales and timelines that exceed a human life, that we might encounter the edge of those tasks and recognize them as important without being able to participate in them or even fully understand them. That kind of cosmic humility is difficult. It requires accepting that we are small and that our knowledge is limited and that some doors we encounter are not meant for us to walk through. The Schrock house might be one of those doors, a threshold marked and tended by a man who understood something the rest of us don't, a place where the boundary between one kind of space and another becomes briefly visible to those willing to pay attention. Helen Corrigan paid attention. Dorothy Kern paid attention. The clergy paid attention. They all came away changed, not because they understood what they encountered, but because they allowed themselves to not understand it while still acknowledging its reality. That's harder than it sounds. Our instinct is to categorize and explain and resolve, to fit new experiences into existing frameworks. These people chose instead to expand their frameworks to accommodate experiences that didn't fit. I think Jakob Schrock would have appreciated that. I think that's what he was doing when he left Illinois and came to the Ozarks and built a house he never intended to live in. He was expanding his framework. He was making space for something that didn't fit anywhere else. And then, when the time came, he walked through. That image stays with me. An Amish man in his late 40s standing in an empty house he built with his own hands, looking out a window at hills that go on for miles, feeling the presence of something on the other side of a boundary that most people never see, making a choice. I hope it was the right choice. I hope Bishop Yoder was correct and Jakob found peace. I hope the threshold he was tending served whatever purpose he believed it served, but I also hope nobody tries to close it. Because if Jakob Schrock thought it was important enough to build a house around and to give his life to watching, then maybe we should honor that judgment, even if we don't share his understanding. Maybe some doors are meant to stay open. Maybe some houses are meant to stand empty. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, not because we lack the tools to solve them, but because solving them would eliminate something valuable from the world. The Schrock house is still there. If you drive west out of Galena on County Road J and take the unmarked turnoff about 40 miles in, you'll see it. White paint peeling, steep roof, windows too narrow, proportions slightly wrong in a way you can't quite name. You can park at the base of the driveway if you want. You can walk up to the house if you want. The county won't stop you as long as you don't try to enter or damage the property. But before you do, ask yourself why you're going. If it's just curiosity or the desire to be scared or the hope of seeing something supernatural, I'd suggest you stay in your car. If it's because you genuinely want to pay attention to a place where the world might be slightly different than it is everywhere else, then walk up slowly. Notice the way the air feels. Notice the quality of light. Notice whether the house seems to be waiting for something. And if you go inside, if you climb those stairs to the northeastern bedroom, if you see marks on the floor or feel cold air or hear sounds that don't have sources, don't try to explain them. Don't try to debunk them. Just notice them. Acknowledge them. Treat them with respect. Then leave. Don't stay too long. Don't push for revelation. Just bear witness the way Jacob bore witness, the way Dorothy bore witness, the way all the people who took this place seriously chose to engage with it. That's enough. That's what the house seems to ask for. Not understanding, not resolution, just attention and respect. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What do you do with a story like this? If you were the county commissioner in 1942 and 3 clergy members told you a house contained something unexplainable but not dangerous, would you seal it the way they did? Would you want it investigated? Would you want it torn down? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you land on this. If you're new here, welcome. This is the kind of story we work with on this channel. Things that happened in documented history that don't fit neatly into categories. Events that credible people reported but that science and religion and folklore can't quite account for. Stories that stay with you not because they're dramatic, but because they're unresolved. We've looked at other locations in the Ozarks where ordinary people encountered something they couldn't explain and had to build their lives around that unknowing. We've examined historical records from Appalachia where whole communities rearranged themselves in response to events nobody would talk about publicly. We've traced the testimony of miners and farmers and teachers and clergy who all reported similar phenomena in different locations decades apart. The pattern that emerges is this. The world is stranger than our official narratives admit, not in flashy ways, not in ways that make for good headlines, but in quiet, persistent ways that accumulate over time until you can't ignore them anymore. The Schrock house is one of those accumulations, a place where enough people reported enough consistent experiences that you have to make a choice about what you believe about reality itself. I can't make that choice for you. I can only show you the evidence and the testimony and the ongoing fact of a house that no one will tear down or explain. What you do with that is up to you. Stay curious, stay respectful, pay attention to the edges of things, take care of yourself.